Hey, Sammy, it's Michael. How you doing?
Michael from Florida. What's happening, Michael?
Good, buddy. Sorry, last time I called, it sounded like I was on speed, so my apologies. I was a little over the top.
No problem.
It was kind of an intense day. This is, kind of depressing. I understand your position, and I understand the fellows there as well. I don't know if you guys ever lived any place else besides the coasts. The only thing I can tell you regarding the cultural connection to the Confederate flag, and I'm not a born and bred Floridian. I moved down here when I was 21 years old, but I'm just saying that there's a lot of historical and blood ties to that feeling in that time. And, when you guys say that they never really got over the war, it sounds like a horrible cliche, but it's actually true. I mean, there are certain elements of the Southern society and Confederate society which will never understand and never accept the defeat that went on 150 years ago. And it seems absurd to most of us to think like that, but that's culturally was passed down first through Reconstruction, then through Jim Crow laws, and eventually, up until the Civil Rights, or really the Voting Rights Act was passed, because it was more important, and believe it or not, in many respects, it allowed people to vote, and that allowed black representation to more accurately represent the demographic and the population at the time. So that resentment has never gone away. It's always been bubbling below the surface. And then in the 80s, you had a serious backlash against everything in the 60s and the 70s, which was considered radical and, essentially a seam splitter in as far as our society was concerned. And those people have never forgotten that. So there's always had a strain of this kind of behavior. And its cultural ties to that flag and that war are generational. I mean, I hate to say this, but it's almost, like my father was a Union man, and like my father before him, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that kind of feeling that while you're not a Confederate in the sense that everyone values or advocates slavery or the subjugation of human beings, there is a cultural feeling that this was our way of life. You are never changing our way of life. And no matter how many Army troops you may send down, and
all right, but wait a second. Okay, listen, Michael, I understand.
This kid was a virulent product of that generation. Yeah, go ahead.
I understand what you're saying, but where does the idea, when you say like this is our way of life, what changed in terms of their way of life was only the subjugation of black people, right? I mean, it wasn't like all of a sudden like,
yes and no.
You guys are now going to have winter.
Yeah, that's the most obvious element of it. Yeah, but there was literally people walking into your house, into your neighborhood, into your state, and saying, you will do what we say the way we want you to do it and not any way else.
What was it? Let's be specific. What are they going to do? Like, you're going to now have to wear your underwear on the outside. No. It was, you just can't enslave people anymore.
You can't own for human beings. No, I understand that. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so
you cannot run a plantation.
Right.
You can
run a plantation.
Not to vote.
You can run a plantation.
Don't forget.
You just can't have slaves.
Not just since Sherman's March to the Sea. It's literally been since then. Remember, Jim Crow and the after effects of Reconstruction. This would be a great interview if you ever wanted to do that, is to find I'm sure you guys probably thought of it, but a historical professor who will tell you the seeds of resentment in the South were not sown necessarily by the defeat after the Civil War. They were sown after Reconstruction because of how they were subjugated to the effects of Northern society and the cultures and norms that were foisted upon them in their eyes. This is their argument. Okay, that's where the actual rise of the Klan comes from. That's where the Democratic Party back then became essentially a wholly owned operation of the Confederate Army. Okay, all that started after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction period, and it never subsided. It was essentially codified through Jim Crow laws, and then finally the Supreme Court says, no, you can't do this anymore.
You know
Not
what?
just that you can't own people.
Listen, hold on for 1 second. But Michael.
Yeah.
And I agree with this. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I don't think that you're offering it as an alibi as much as you are as an explanation. But let me say this. Like you say, they were the Democratic Party at that time, right? Was essentially the sort of the extension of the Confederacy in some respects, and if the Confederacy, if people from the South could manage to separate their cultural from support of Democrats, If they could manage that, the symbolism of actually now voting for a Republican, because let's remember, Lincoln was a Republican. And so somehow, some way, these people who embrace their heritage and are so, the symbols are so important, could actually change their voting patterns to vote for the party that subjugated them in the first place, right? The Republicans. If they could manage that, then maybe they could manage to have a new flag.
Not happening. And let me explain why.
Well, I understand why it's not happening.
No,
because their politicians pander to the lowest common denominator.
Your analysis is correct that you got the right answer for the wrong reason. And I'm not and we can just agree to disagree on this. But they migrated, and this started after World War II. You know this story. The Dixiecrats with Strom Thurmond walking out in the 48 convention. I mean, you know the history. And so they just migrated to a place which was essentially a kind of like another world in between the two parties for a long period of time before Ronald Reagan and the post-60s now Republican Party with Nixon and those guys. Nixon Land is a great book on that, by the way. I know you know that. They basically inculcated all those old Dixiecrat ideas into the base of the Republican Party.
Oh,
and
right.
That's where they migrated to.
Right.
They don't care about, this isn't a D or R kind of argument with these people. It's who is going to accurately represent my values, period, end of story. That's why I use the
It's
union
racism.
analogy.
I mean, that's the thing is that even there, I mean, I understand, but I'm just saying that like the arguments that we hear that the flag is so cherished because it represents our values. Well, the Democrats used to represent your values, and you were able to relinquish that word. I understand the values are the same, right? That the racists just changed their party. I get that. I'm just saying that if you're, so married.
Of course. Let me make a statement that's probably going to get me in a lot of trouble, but since you don't have my point of view, I can say it. It's not unlike being analogous to hardcore right-wing Israelis being more loyal to the Israeli flag and the cause of Judaism than they are to the cause of the republic in this country. It's very similar.
Hardcore
it's a
Israelis?
which is never going to be broken for whatever reason. It's just never going to get changed. I want to ask you one quick thing before I know you're trying on time, so I don't get a chance to talk to you a whole lot. If Obama had made as concerted an effort following Newtown to go door to door, to go to Capitol Hill, to make the arguments and press the flesh and really, literally pound out his opinion and his argument, I guarantee you he would have been able to go ahead and get some kind of gun control legislation, at least in terms of a registry. But he was not willing to do that. He did it for TPA. He did it for a trade authority, which apparently is abhorrent to most of the scholars who study it. But he wouldn't do that for guns. When he haven't even freaking Joe Scarborough, that mouth breather, was sitting there saying that that a national background check was proper. He didn't press the advantage. And if you want to know something, it's a failure of leadership, and it's at his feet, nobody else's. My opinion.
I don't know if I disagree with that. I mean, I can understand an analysis where he thought that he would have more ability to move Democrats, and that's what he's been doing. He's been pushing Democrats. That's why I'm not sure that is the proper analogy. To me, the proper analogy really is more about like the public option. All right, or the bankruptcy cram down where he had to lobby was Democrats because and it's true that he did not make those type of efforts in terms of gun control, but I can understand the mentality of like those efforts will be wasted on Republicans. Let's remember the lobbying he's doing is on Democrats. He's visiting Congress not to talk to Republicans, but to talk to Democrats. And he could have done that with the cram down. Oh, I agree with you. It's
infuriating.
I agree.
Let me tell you something. We're going to have to disagree. I don't think there was a national consensus for public option as there was for some type of limited gun control or at least national registration following Newtown. We slaughtered 26-year-olds, 20 of them, as they sat in their chairs and huddled in corners, and we can't get a national legislation passed to make sure there's some type of background check? Are you freaking kidding me? That you will never have that kind of tidal wave where even mainstream movement conservatives are going to back you up because you got their ass pinned against the wall.
What?
You walk your tail up to Capitol Hill, you knock on every freaking door, and you say, "We're going to get this done." And I don't give a flip whether you agree with me or not. That's how leadership is done, man.
Yep.
You don't sit there and say, "Well, I hope we kind of got the wave, but I'll just kind of ride it." F that. Do your job. And I'll tell you something. There's a lot of Democrats who are more disgusted and more disappointed in this president because of his lack of leadership and his lack of intuition than they are with the Republicans, who we already know who those people are. That's the biggest problem. And I think Hillary's going to have a hell of a problem as well. I don't mean to rant. I don't mean to sound like...
All right. Well, I hear you. I appreciate the call, Michael.
It's infuriating that he expends that kind of political capital for an idea which is at best questionable in its value.
Exactly.
And then he turns around and he wants to sit there and tell me that he feels bad about little kids dying and about having to do these damn church recitals every time someone gets slaughtered. Okay, I feel bad too. Guess what? You've got a bully pulpit. Use it. Stand up and go do something for once instead of sitting back there and listening to Goofy Valerie Jarrett or whoever the hell you were listening to. For the life of me, I'll never understand why this guy never pressed his advantage.
Yeah.
And you know what? He doesn't. You may dislike Bill Clinton, and you may disagree with him. That some bitch has got political instincts to die for.
Well, I just think. Listen, I think part of this. I mean, it may be the case that your analysis about his lack of effort is clear in terms of the gun control. I don't know that the politics were there because I think that's I think that's a much broader failure. Joe Scarborough at that time thought he was going to run for president. The fact of the matter is there was a lot of the rest of the Republican Party hadn't moved an inch. And so, but I think the point is, but Michael, wait a second, I got to let you go.
Sam.
No.
At that small juncture in time, we're going to
Michael,
disagree on this.
Yeah,
I think we could have moved them.
I think, but I think it's more. The point has more validity when you're talking about lobbying Democrats. That's just the bottom line. All right, appreciate the call, buddy.